Hi, I'm Justin Keay, Field Specialist in Horticulture with MU Extension, and I'm going to talk today about managing fertilization on a diversified vegetable farm and how to use a fertilizer calculator to make that easier. I oftentimes get questions from diversified growers on how to develop a fertility management plan for a crop that has many different farms, such as a CSA vegetable farm or a market farm that sells primarily to farmers markets. Let's start by taking a look at a standard soil test report. Now, the crop selected for this report was tomatoes, and on most soil test reports, you're limited to 3 or 4 crops to receive recommendations for. So if we take a look at this report, the recommendations are 90 pounds of nitrogen and 25 pounds of phosphorus per acre for this tomato crop. Another piece of information on the soil test report will be our percentage organic matter, our cation exchange capacity, and the soil texture. There's other fields on the soil test report, but I want to focus on these for now. Now, the maximum recommendation for tomatoes for nitrogen is 130 pounds per acre. Because this soil has so much organic matter, we're getting 40 pounds of nitrogen credited from that soil organic matter. So that organic matter over the course of the growing season will be mineralized by bacteria and the nitrogen will be released in a plant available form. So we have some nitrogen credit in the bank. You'll notice that a soil test report in general will not report actual nitrogen values in the soil because nitrogen is mobile and transient, and a nitrogen value isn't very helpful when you're figuring out a fertility management plan. Because we have 40 pounds of nitrogen credited from the soil organic matter, we're only receiving a recommendation to add 90 pounds. I want to bring your attention to the University of Georgia fertilizer calculator. I found this to be a very helpful tool when helping folks calculate fertilizer recommendations based off soil tests. So let's take a look on the left-hand side. I've input the pounds per acre recommended of nitrogen and phosphorus. I've selected pounds per acre to receive the recommendations in. When we move down, we'll see that there's a lot of different fertilizers that you can select, and you can also input your own fertilizer. So I input a 1300 feather meal. You can add the price per pound, and then I have a 342, which is a poultry litter price per pound. You'll input these numbers and click calculate, and you'll receive the panel on the right. So this panel will show you how much of these fertilizers to apply to achieve the recommendations you selected. So it will take 548 pounds of 1300 and 625 pounds of the 342 poultry litter to get the recommendations of 90 pounds per acre of N and 25 pounds per acre of phosphorus. If we move over in the NPK section here, surpluses will be shown in blue and deficits will be shown in red. There's 3 different scenarios listed on this calculator panel, and the highest scoring, meaning the most accurately fulfilling the recommendations of the soil test report, will be the top one. This one has a score of 80 out of 100, which is pretty good, and it also lists the cost per acre to fertilize this crop. So you're going to input your pounds per unit area of fertilizer recommended, choose different fertilizers. You can run multiple different scenarios and review the scores and costs that the fertilizer calculator computes. And in general, you want to try to minimize excesses because you're going to be wasting money and there's the environmental risk of excess fertilizers, as well as deficiencies so that we make sure the crop is getting the nutrients they need. But one of the challenges of fertility management in diverse cropping system is there's oftentimes many different crops, and it can be really challenging to use specific recommendations for each crop. Now, in an ideal world with enough time and management skill, that could be achieved, but it might not be practical or feasible on all farms. So one way to think about making this easier is to understand the nitrogen requirements of the different crops. So this panel is from our soil test interpretation and recommendation guide for commercial fruit, vegetables, and turf. And this lists the maximum amount of nitrogen required for many different vegetable crops, as well as the suggested application times if side dressing is recommended. So we have a baseline to understand what the nitrogen recommendations are for each crop. So one way to proceed in fertilizing diverse cropping systems is focusing on dialing in your fertility for your highest value crops. Maybe on your farm that's tomatoes, maybe on your farm that's winter squash, but we do have the opportunity to dial that in. Now, the other crops in a diverse system, we could think about breaking them into low, medium, and high nitrogen feeders. And I've done that below based off of the previous recommendation guide from our soil lab. So I've grouped these into low, medium, and high nitrogen feeders for the purpose of developing a fertility management plan. So these are those crop groupings in low, medium, and high, green, yellow, and red. And so the target N rate per acre is listed above each category. And let's just say we have soil test results that have very high phosphorus and potassium, which is not uncommon on vegetable farms. And so we don't need any of those nutrients. Our organic matter is 2.5%, which means we will have 50 pounds of residual nitrogen released over the course of the growing season. And we only really need to worry about applying nitrogen. So we can calculate the actual nitrogen to be applied by taking the target nitrogen per acre for each of these crop groupings, subtracting the nitrogen per acre that will be released from the organic matter, and that will give us how much nitrogen we need to apply. So in the example of our middle medium feeder category, let's say we have 110 pounds of nitrogen per acre recommended for cucumbers. We subtract the nitrogen credit from the organic matter, and we get that we will need an actual 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So when we adjust the nitrogen recommendations for the organic matter, we only need 10 pounds of nitrogen for the low feeders, 60 pounds for the medium feeders, and 90 pounds for the high feeders. So let's say we're going to use feather meal, which is a high nitrogen organic fertilizer, as our choice. So it's 45 bucks for 50 pounds, so that's 90 cents a pound. And our bed sizes are 3 by 100 feet, so that's 300 square feet. And the actual nitrogen we need to apply to these different feeder levels is listed there. Let's just dial in on some of the medium feeders like cucumbers and garlic. Let's go back to our fertilizer calculator and we input 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen. This time we're going to change pounds to acre to pounds per 300 square feet. We'll input our 1200 feather meal at 90 cents per pound. And the output values are that we'll need 3.4 pounds of 1200 per 300 square feet. This will give us a cost of $3.10 per bed. So we'll need 3.4 pounds of feather meal per bed, about $3 a bed. And then we can repeat these calculations for the low feeders and the heavy feeders. Just to zoom in a little bit more on this fertilizer calculator, you're going to input the amount of nutrients recommended, select the unit area that you want the recommendations for, input your fertilizer selected as well as the price per pound, and you will receive these output values. So let's go back to these crop categories of low, medium, and high. Low is green, yellow is medium, and red is high. And I ran these through this calculator, and so we need 0.6 pounds of feather meal for the low feeders, 3.4 pounds of feather meal for the medium feeders, and 5.2 pounds of feather meal for the high feeders. And this is per bed per 300 square feet. But you can customize this to any bed dimensions you have. So at this point, we can break out the scale. So we'll start with our low feeders. We need 0.6 pounds of feather meal. So we can put that feather meal into a small pail, mark the level with a marker or wax pencil at 0.6 pounds, and then repeat this for the 3.4 and 5.2 pound amounts. You can also use 3 different size and color containers for these different feeding categories. Either way, you end up with a volume that you can dump some fertilizer into and know how much pounds you're getting into that container. And that can make it very quick and easy. Instead of weighing out fertilizer for every bed, you can just have a volume that you can eyeball and throw into the bucket. It can be helpful to draw a field map and color code the beds based off low, medium, and heavy feeders. You're going to then spread the fertilizer as evenly as possible on the beds or field. You can do this by hand with a drop spreader or a broadcast spreader. And then you're going to want to incorporate this shallowly or leave on the soil surface in a no-till situation. I want to give one final example because I know folks are very interested in incorporating cover crops into their farm to support fertility management. So let's start with our heavy feeding crops. things like sweet corn, potatoes, cabbage, and broccoli. We've already done some calculations, and we know that we need 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre based off of the organic matter of the soil in this previous example. A common cover crop combination includes a grass and a legume. So an oat, pea, and vetch mix can contain about 175 pounds of total nitrogen per acre in that cover crop mix. A portion of that nitrogen becomes available over the course of the growing cycle of a given crop. So oftentimes we want to understand how much of that nitrogen will become available in the first 3 months. So in this cover crop mix, about 20 pounds of that nitrogen becomes available in that first 90 days. So 20% of 174 is 35 pounds of total nitrogen per acre released to the cash crop in 90 days. So we can then take the amount of nitrogen that we need, which is 90 pounds. We can subtract the cover crop contribution in that first 90 days, which is 35 pounds. And we would come up with 50 pounds of nitrogen actually required to feed these heavy feeding crops. So the maximum recommendation is 160 pounds per acre, but we don't need that much because we have good organic matter, so we only need 90 pounds. And then when we add the cover crop, we subtract another 35 pounds, and we end up with that final amount of 55 pounds of nitrogen per acre required to be applied. These resources will be in the YouTube description. Our soil test interpretation and recommendation guide for commercial fruits and veggies. This is a really helpful resource if you're looking into dialing in your fertility, as well as the UGA fertilizer calculator, which is a helpful tool to make all the calculations quick and simple. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.